We're in the book of Ecclesiastes this morning. Preacher's done so much blabbering, you don't have a lot of time left. So anyway, let's talk about Ecclesiastes. If you've ever studied this book or tried to study this book, you know it's different than probably any other book in the Bible. Just from the vantage point of kind of the emphasis, it's kind of depressing to read it, because the book is full of statements that, what's the use, that kind of thing. Vanity of vanities, or striving after the wind. I don't know that I've ever personally taught through it. I've started it a couple of times, and again, it's hard to parse out sometimes, so we'll try to do that eventually. The author is unnamed, but most conservative scholars would say that it was Solomon, and there's some good reasons for that. The only identifying mark we have in the book of Ecclesiastes is the fact there in Ecclesiastes, the first verse says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." Now, obviously, Solomon would fit that, but there were other sons and descendants of David, but Solomon is the one that seems to fit as well as anyone, because if you go on through the book, you'll find, again, even though his name isn't specifically mentioned, it's fair to assume that this descendant of David is meant rather than some later descendant, and that's confirmed by some internal evidences in the book. Things like chapter 1, verse 16 speaks of his unrivaled wisdom. That fits Solomon pretty well, right? Solomon was, as kind of say, the smartest man who ever lived. God gave him that kind of wisdom. It speaks of this writer's unequaled wealth in chapter 2, verse 8. His tremendous retinue of servants, chapter 2, verse 7. The opportunities he had for carnal or fleshly pleasures, chapter 2, verse 3, and his extensive building activities, chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. So again, unless you're going into the book with probably some other motives in mind, it's pretty hard to come away with thinking it's anyone other than Solomon, but I won't die on that hill, but it seems to fit pretty well. The date for this book, we try to kind of narrow it down into a time frame. Ecclesiastes was, if we're going to assume Solomon is the author, then likely this was written later in his life. Solomon reigned from, I think, about 970 to 930, some BC, somewhere in there. Jewish sources, and again, this doesn't make it Bible, but Jewish sources, according to them, Solomon wrote the Song of Songs in his early years, expressing his young man's love. Then he wrote Proverbs in his mature years, manifesting a middle-aged person's wisdom. And he reportedly wrote Ecclesiastes in his declining years, revealing an old man's sorrow. And in this case, these Jewish sources are saying, you know what, Solomon reached this point in his life after trying everything under the sun, as the book keeps saying over and over again. Nothing brought him the satisfaction he desired. So they think this is probably written later in that reign, maybe right around 930 or so BC. Perhaps right before his death. This source that I looked at assumes that maybe after Solomon reached this point, after trying everything else, numerous women and concubines and all of that, that they claim he probably repented. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, right? And if he did, that would have probably been something that later Bible writers might have pointed back to, so we can't assume that, but however it worked out, we can hope, perhaps, that he did. The purpose of Ecclesiastes, at least Gleason Archer puts it this way, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And again, this is timely. The book of Ecclesiastes is timely because every generation of humankind has searched for the meaning of life, right? People go through their life thinking, well, what's this all about? Life should make me happy, that type of mindset. Archer says the purpose of Ecclesiastes was to convince humankind of the uselessness of any worldview which does not rise above the horizon of humankind itself. See, that's our problem. We search for meaning, we search for significance at the human level. And the book of Ecclesiastes is designed to drive a stake in the heart of that way of thinking. If we don't think any higher than the level of ourselves, we're doomed to failure there. The book pronounces the verdict of vanities, or striving after the wind, or uselessness, your version may say. The book pronounces this verdict upon any philosophy of life which regards the created world or human enjoyment as an end in itself. That's destined to failure. And that's why you maybe have run into people that says, well, I'm going to do what I want because I want to be happy. And happiness isn't the goal in life. Being blessed by God is. That's a different thing. But happiness, I can't think of the number of times I've heard that as a preacher. Someone chooses to do something sinful because I deserve it. I deserve to be happy. Not necessarily. Well, Ecclesiastes deals with all of that. To view personal happiness as the highest good in life is sheer folly, according to this writer, in view of the preeminent value of God himself as over against the created universe. Right? That puts it in a pretty good nutshell. No matter what we try, and we'll go through a whole list of things in just a moment, but it is, this writer, again, likely Solomon, tried it all.
I think the text not as depressing, rather it's just an affirmation.
Yeah.
I don't know when Solomon was trying some of these things, but he was trying to find happiness or not.
Sure.
But he's just saying, he said, I have men singers and women singers. That's stereo, right?
Sure.
And he was just saying that doesn't complete. And so, 1 John 2, verse 17 says that the world passes away, whoso does the will of the Father abides forever. And that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
We've all probably chased our own set of whirlwinds in life.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, not me, like cars.
Right.
Spend a lot of money on cars. Well, I put a tag on my first Rocket 300 that on the dash that beware of covetous, and there's a knot and a bunch of things that supposed to do. We need to be reminded of that. Some
Sure.
nice cars, probably one is enough, but that's one is enough. But that's not going to provide happiness. That's not going to provide for your soul. I think that's the thing. What the text is about.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being happy. There's nothing wrong with certain things. It's just if we make that the source of what we're after. All right, let's look at a brief outline of Ecclesiastes. And the kind of the neat thing about this book, if you really want the answer to what Ecclesiastes is saying, you can find it in the last couple of verses of this whole writing, and we'll get to that. But the problem is, first of all, stated in verses 1 through 11. And again, for sake of time, we won't go through all of that right now. But Solomon takes the first 11 verses of the book and basically states the problem. He says, there appears to be no satisfaction in this world. Right? And this writer has looked at a lot of different venues. Maybe it would be good for me to at least read these first 11 verses. Obviously, we can't read it all, but just listen to how he starts here. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? And again, maybe you think back to a time in your life where you felt that way, right? Man, I've worked 30 years at this job, and what have I got out of it? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along on its circular courses. The wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, they will flow again. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see, this, it's new? Already, if it has existed for ages, which were before us, there is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among them, or among those, rather, who will come later still. What's the use? It starts out. That's the problem. And I can think back, those perhaps in more modern times that have had it all. You read their biographies, and how does it usually end? It was never enough. Or they despaired of, billionaires despair of finding any satisfaction in life. So there's the problem, stated pretty clearly. All right, then the major part of the whole letter, chapter 1, verse 12, clear through chapter 12, verse 8, is the problem studied. So this writer sets it out. Here's the problem. And he says, well, okay, we're going to put all this to the test. Satisfaction is sought. If you're going to try to find satisfaction in the world, let's try to do that. In chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 6, the writer talks about satisfaction sought experimentally, just the idea of trying it all. Hedonistic living is kind of the fancy word for that. Eat, drink, and be merry. Well, he didn't find satisfaction there. Then chapter 3 through almost the end of chapter 12 as well, satisfaction is sought philosophically. Get the word out. And that's just kind of approaching the problem not experientially, not trying it all out, but just reasoning through, well, where is this going to end? The second part of Solomon's search for the greatest good was conducted philosophically in accordance with the highest wisdom his mind could muster. And again, wisest man who ever lived put his mind to this and didn't come up with any answer besides God. Again, however, he discovered that ultimate satisfaction cannot be found in earthly things. Now let's go to the end of the book, and we find what the writer comes to. It's interesting. Sums it up pretty well. Chapter 12, verses 9 through 14 is the problem solved, right? After putting his mind to it, after putting his body to it, what does he come up with as a conclusion? It says, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. That sounds a lot like Solomon. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. The words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. The conclusion, when all has been heard, or as we might say, when the dust settles in this quest for personal satisfaction and happiness, he says that when all has been heard, the conclusion is this: fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Now, we don't have to stop here and just want to focus on the judgment of God falling upon sinners. That's universal. But again, this idea, if we can't rise above ourselves, if there's a purpose not beyond the human level, we're doomed to failure. You've got to look above. God is the one to be revered. God, of course, is the only one through whom we can find the satisfaction we look for. I've chosen satisfaction as the theme for the book, and again, it's the search for that, if you will. The book records Solomon's struggle to find a satisfactory answer to the meaning and purpose of life. After much experimentation, he discovers that any philosophy, again, which doesn't rise above the human level is meaningless, striving after the wind, vanity of vanities. The only lifestyle which ultimately satisfies is one that is God-centered. True satisfaction, according to Ecclesiastes, is not found in a self-centered lifestyle. And notice with me, and I'm going to have to go through this list pretty quickly, but it's a long list of things that were tried, thoughts that were chased out in this pursuit. The following endeavors were found to be striving after the wind in the book of Ecclesiastes. Number one, don't have it numbered here, so I'll quit doing that. The first one is in chapter 1, verse 14. We know that the writer says it was vanity, all the works of men. He could have stopped there, but he goes on to explain it a lot of ways. But all the works of humans are vain. Pleasure, chapter 2, verse 1, was found to be striving after the wind. The profit from one's labor, chapter 2, verse 11. Chapter 2, 15 reveals that the quest for wisdom is ultimately useless without God. Focus on earthly accomplishments, chapter 2, verse 21. You can go to chapter 2 and read through all the accomplishments this man had in life. You thought, well, boy, that's a good goal for life, right? Get a lot of things done. Didn't bring him the satisfaction he was looking for. An overemphasis or misemphasis on life and living in chapter 3, verse 19 is said to be vanity. Not that there's anything wrong with living, right? But what are we living for? Competition, chapter 4, verse 4, is said to be vanity or striving after the wind. Stockpiling riches, chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Chapter 4, verse 16 says that trying to please everyone is useless. Some of us can probably relate to that, right? You're a people pleaser. That's a dead-end road, isn't it? Not that we shouldn't try to get along and be pleasing type people, but it isn't going to bring what we're searching for. The foolish use of words and promises, chapter 5, verses 4 through 7. Comes back to money in chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. That's vanity. Living long and having a large family but not being content, chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. Family's a good thing. Large families, nothing wrong with that. But if that's where we're trying to find our happiness or source of blessing, without God, it's just like the rest of these things. Being able to use words masterfully, chapter 6, verse 11, is really useless without God. Association with those who don't think soberly about life, chapter 7, verse 6. Humankind's attitude toward evil, chapter 8, verse 10. The system of justice and retribution, chapter 8, verse 14. And that's as real as today's headlines as well, right? Is there any justice out there? The future, chapter 11, verse 8. Ultimately, you say, well, we're looking for a better future. Well, that's fine, but don't put your hope there. Then finally, chapter 12, verse 8, we're getting right near the end. Death itself is viewed as useless or vain or striving after the wind. So that's a long list. Probably some of us can relate to some of those more than others, but every human probably goes through stretches in life where we get caught up in trying to find, satisfaction in those things. It doesn't work. True satisfaction, according to our theme, is only found in a God-centered lifestyle. And of course, we read chapter 12, verses 13 and 14 a minute ago that talks about fearing and listening to God, following His way. But sprinkled throughout the book of Ecclesiastes is the idea of contentment. Let me just, in case you're writing them down, by the way, let me know if you want a copy of the notes. We covered a lot of territory. You're welcome to that. In chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, chapter 3, verse 12 through 13, and verse 22, and then chapter 5, verses 18 through 20. Chapter 8, chapter 9, there's a few verses there. So ultimately, contentment's part of this package. Striving, and this author strove in a lot of different areas, but sometimes, again, fearing God and being content with life goes a long way. All right, one more phrase. We got about 4 minutes left here. And I've missed out on some of this as we've gone through some of these books lately, and I kind of fell off my radar. But we started out by trying to find references to Christ in these Old Testament books, and Ecclesiastes is a book where there's no direct prophetic reference to the Messiah, right? There's no place. I'm trying to think. Probably shouldn't say this until I search that out, but I'm not aware of any direct quote in the New Testament back to Ecclesiastes, and don't hold me to that. But I don't remember one. But that doesn't mean we can't find some things in the book of Ecclesiastes that may point to Christ. And again, this isn't scripture, so we're drawing some comparisons here that are human-based in that sense. But a couple of things I thought of. The person of Christ stands out in two significant ways in Ecclesiastes. This book is centered on trying to find the greatest good, and of course, ultimate satisfaction. Well, I think there's a comparison we can draw there legitimately to Jesus, right? Jesus, in the New Covenant writings, for sure, we're pointed to, and it ought to be expected because, he's the Son of God, and we're talking about finding true satisfaction in God. Jesus, of course, is the one who could be pointed to as the ultimate satisfaction of life. What did Jesus say to the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well? Remember? I have living water to offer you. And of course, he was ultimately that living water. And she says, give me some of that water. I won't have to go to the well all the time. Well, Jesus was talking about a deeper level than physical water, but Jesus, in essence, was saying, I'm the one you'll find satisfaction in. And that's a theme that runs throughout Scripture. But right near the end as well, we noted there in verse 11 of Ecclesiastes 12, the writer says, the words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections, And masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. Now, in my version, that has the capital letter on that shepherd, so these translators were thinking that was looking ahead to Christ. And of course, Jesus, and again, that's just a translational thing, but Jesus referred to himself as the Good Shepherd, didn't he? John chapter 10 and verse 11. It's interesting as well in Colossians chapter 2. This book had a lot to say about wisdom, right? Sometimes we try to find satisfaction in our Bible knowledge or whatever. Nothing wrong with Bible knowledge, but the Bible points us to the source of ultimate knowledge, and that's Jesus. Notice how it's stated in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 3. Colossians 2 and verse 3 makes this statement about Christ. Let me read verses. Let's start in verse 1 of Colossians 2. It says, for I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf, and for those who are in Laodicea, and for all those who have not personally seen my face, that their hearts may be encouraged, having been knit together in love, and attaining to all the wealth that comes from the full assurance of understanding, resulting in a true knowledge of God's mystery, that is Christ himself, in whom, and this is, verse 2 ended with talking about Christ, in whom, in Christ, are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So if we're going to go on a quest for wisdom in our efforts to find meaning in life, ultimately, of course, as Christians of God, as Christians devoted to following God, we're going to seek that in Jesus. All right. That was a whirlwind tour. Thank you. We're going to take some time, Lord willing, next week to move on to the final 5th book of wisdom in the Old Testament, and that's the Song of Songs. So we'll look forward to sharing something about that. Thank you.